And next, I'd like to introduce Mikael Homanen. He is the Senior Specialist of Research at the United Nations Principle of Responsible Investing. He's also an Honorary Research Fellow at the Business School in London, formerly known as Cass Business School. His research focuses on the intersection of externalities and financial markets, with a further focus on banking and investor ECG and ECG policies. Today, his talk is titled Scaling Up Social Investing, which is also known as SRI, and he will be discussing the power of SRI. So welcome, Mikael. It'll be wonderful to have you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much for having me. If you don't mind, give me just a few seconds and then I'll share my video as well as my slides, if that's all right. Great. Could you confirm that you can see the slide deck?
Yeah, we can all see the slides now, I think.
Oh, fantastic. Great. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this conference, and I really look forward to any questions from the audience as well. So I'll just begin by clarifying that I heard that this is, of course, titled The Responsibility of Businesses. And it was nice to hear that in your previous session, you heard a little bit more about SRI, ESG, and things like that. But what I'm going to now really be highlighting is really the role of finance when it comes to changing corporate behavior. Because ultimately, what we want to do in terms of tackling societally important issues is we want to change corporate behavior. The thing that's always somewhat left understood is corporations exist primarily because we decided to invest in them in the first place. And what's also more important is that that money has to come from somewhere. And that's, in the end, you and me. You and me are the households of the economy. We have savings in this economy. We are the ones who choose which financial investment vehicles we have our money in, and they invest in the companies themselves. So we have a huge role to play when it comes to tackling these important issues. So I'll begin this presentation with just giving you a bit of a practical example as to how one very specific decision how we can actually change corporate behavior through our financial institutions. And then I'll really get into the nitty-gritty details of the financial investment chain, talking about pension funds, mutual funds, things of that nature. How is it that we can choose where we invest our money in, and how then that actually affects how companies are then changing their behavior. And I'll end the talk with talking a little bit more about PRI and what PRI is actually doing when it comes to bringing investors together to change, ultimately, corporate behavior. So where do we start? I think finance, for good reasons, always gets a little pulled up in confusion in terms of what is it that's really in Canary Wharf, a bunch of traders doing a bunch of random stuff. But in the end, finance is very simple in the sense that we have our money somewhere, and that money is being invested in assets. And the reason why I brought this picture here is this is from the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. Now, some of you might remember this from a few years ago. These were major year-long protests against the pipeline project that was going through Native American community territories, major rivers, and it brought together large segments of society. It brought together environmental activists, of course, indigenous communities, and in this particular case, it brought even US Army war veterans. These were groups that rarely worked together at this scale, and as a social movement, it was quite phenomenal. Now, where does finance kick in? The finance story of this was extremely interesting for me, given that I'm a researcher. This was something that I'd never seen before. I'd never seen such a large-scale activism against the financial institutions that were financing the project in the first place. So a project is a pipeline that's managed by an oil company or a pipeline company, but someone needs to give the money for that company to create that actual investment. The money for the pipeline to be built needs to come from somewhere. That came from the banks. Millions of people that were financing this project. And this was a particular moment during the protest where over 700,000 people in the end, it was over 1 million people, came together and told their banks, if you do not stop financing this pipeline, I will stop financing you. And there were thousands of people that took away their deposit accounts from these banks, explicitly because their own banks, which they did not realize, was investing in this controversial project that they didn't agree on. And so to give you a little bit more flavor on this event, this was at US Bank Stadium in Minnesota, if I remember correctly. This was during a live football game. And US best way and small successful London quite background against HSBC with a lot of deposit accounts because of this event. And not only did they lose deposits across the world, but just to give you a little bit of flavor in terms of like who's actually doing the protesting, the evidence seems to suggest that a lot of the heat that the banks are getting come from where you expect it the most. People who have green preferences, other societal preferences. In this particular case, you could see fairly clearly that bank branches got hit the most in the US, in counties especially where more people believed in climate change. And it's also a partial reason why in big cities we see a lot of these branch protests. So that's really us as households making the decision, why is my money in this particular organization? Now, the next step is, if we take our money away, does that actually change the behavior of the companies? Well, in this particular case, this is a long list, so I'm not going to go through it, but in the end, within just this one project, there were major reevaluations by the banks, cities, pension funds, investment managers, all divesting in different forms. And what's interesting is, anecdotally, we know that even today, a lot of Canadian fossil fuel intensive projects are having a hard time getting their assets developed, partially because investors are simply not as willing to give anymore financing to invest in these in the first place. So it seems to be a partial mechanism to slow down corporate behavior when it comes to fossil fuel in this particular case, specifically by us having moved our money away, thereby having these middlemen, the financial institutions, not investing in them in the first place. I'll end with the quick example when it comes to deposits, to just say that in the end, you and I as households, we have choices in all our assets. It's just not as obvious. So banks are a very simple example, because you got a deposit account and your bank gives loans to companies. So if you're really ethical and you have strong values and you really want to make sure that your bank is doing the right thing, there does exist a global alliance for banking on values. You can check which ones exist in your country, and you can check if they got long-term savings accounts, deposit accounts, or you do due diligence on your own major banks and just see, okay, how many pipelines are they actually financing? And I'll come to more on that in just a bit. If we move our money to different banks, the more likely it is for us to influence the type of companies that exist in the first place. All of these banks over here with different criteria simply have a strong statement that says each loan needs to make the world a better place. The only reason these loans and these companies therefore exist in the first place is because people have self-selected and said, I'm going to put my money in this bank because I want my money to be used to invest the future that I want. So that's really the practical example. Now, in the end, the financial intermediation chain is sometimes a bit overly confusing. This is by Viva, a rather simple graph in terms of the way I'm trying to hopefully summarize everything throughout this presentation, is that in the end, it's you and I. So we are there on the right side right now. We are the individuals of the economies. It's really, the economy is really there just for us. And in terms of financing, we are the ones that have savings products. We got our deposit accounts, savings accounts, pension funds, insurances, mutual funds, all kinds of stuff. And they're there right in the middle. The middlemen, which in this case is the blue, the stock exchanges. And then it's through those middlemen that we invest in all sectors of the economy. And that means indirectly, you and I know that rarely feels that way unless you actually own stock, but in the end, we do indirectly own all the assets of the economy. Obviously, some people own more than others. And in some particular cases, it's much more direct because you hold stock of Apple. But in the end, all assets of the economy are financed through us. But it's the middlemen that is the most interesting part, at least for me. So presentation, switch around the visual, and I'm going to just give you an extremely brief summary of the academic evidence. So I unfortunately don't have time in this talk to go step by step in terms of what has academia found so far in terms of evidence of changes in behavior, but I'll just give you a brief summary using this. So on the left side is what I said before. This is you and I. We are the retail clients, or we're the high net worth individuals, clients. And all of us, we have money and all the middlemen there. The bottom has the easy example, which is small banks, large banks, social banks. And at the top, it's the one where I'm going to be talking a little bit more. It's the others. These are pension funds, insurance companies, private equity, mutual funds, hedge funds, SRI funds. All of our savings are in all of these vehicles, and those finance all assets in the economy. That can be public companies, private companies, and projects. And so what we know from the academic evidence so far is that the preferences of those on the left are changing. Every year, there's stronger and stronger evidence to show that individuals like you and I are more and more likely to include environmental and social factors in our investment decision process. And those preferences have been shown in a variety of realms when it comes to academic literature. Now, then it's one thing, okay, you and I care a little bit more, but does that matter? Well, yes, we know from the financial institutions in the middle over there that they're changing quite a lot. Banks are hiring climate scientists. Insurance companies have been doing that actually for quite a while. They're incorporating social issues in their investment criteria. And we know that there are more SRI, so socially responsible funds every year. We know that these funds are getting rewarded by the clients that value these issues. And a lot of them are putting long-term capital in place to finance a long-term sustainable future, which is ultimately there to finance, in the case of pension funds, our world, which is the one we want to retire to. So their activities in the middle are changing. And that is also, there's been a lot of evidence to show that the companies are reacting to it. If companies are financed more by these middlemen, I'll be using that word just to make things simple, if more these good guy middlemen are being financed by these companies, there's more and more evidence to show that it increases the likelihood for these public companies or private companies to change their corporate activities towards a more sustainable future. So that's more or less the academic overview that I just wanted to provide. In the end, our preferences are increasingly becoming more important in incorporating E&S issues, environmental and social issues. These institutional owners are changing their behavior, and that is also influencing the companies themselves. So finance really has a role to play when it comes to tackling societal challenges. But then what I'll clarify now is that there's two different realms to the finance puzzle here. One is there's the pre-investment stage and there's the post-investment stage. So the first on the pre-investment side is what we know more or less is that companies that do more environmental and social initiatives are more likely to perform well financially as well. So far, it doesn't come at a cost when it comes to the traditional corporate sphere. That's the general consensus when it comes to just investing in these issues. What are these returns going to look like? That's again on the pre-investment stage. How is it going to look on my returns? But the one that I care a little bit more about is, from a systemic point of view, is the allocation. The pre-investment stage is where do I put my money in terms of new activities? And this one was from Michael Liebrich in Bloomberg. He just summarized it perfectly in one tweet. Past decade has seen 350 billion per year invested in clean energy. That's a phenomenal number, and that number needs to keep going up. We need more clean energy. We need to finance that. The problem for me is that you see in this BankTrack, an NGO in California that does excellent work, showed that 33 banks alone funneled double that money per year into fossil fuel companies. That's just 33 banks alone. So 350 billion over there came from the whole financial system. 630 came from just 33 banks. And US has around 4,000 banks. And that, of course, obviously excludes the rest of the global banking sector and doesn't even talk about the pension funds, the mutual funds, and all the other institutional investors. So on the allocation side, we really are on the wrong trajectory. And for those that are interested in knowing more, BankTrack really does a great league table. It'll show you all the top banks from Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Barclays, who's top of the league charts when it comes to financing fossil fuel intensive sectors. On the pre-investment stage, I'll also mention that it's always a little easier example because it's just, in my opinion, easier to understand. That's where a lot of my early research was. But this same equation works for all the other financial institutions. This is an example that's very closely related to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. There was a moment in New Zealand where the public found out that their pension funds were investing in weapons, sin stocks, and unethical companies. Now, in the end, what they did was they found out the pension funds were doing the obvious. Our pension funds typically invest in the whole market index. So they historically didn't tend to exclude any sectors. They just invested in the whole market because they need to make returns as a pension fund to make sure there's money for us when we retire. Now, then the public found out through great journalistic investigative reporting that our pension funds were actually investing in assets in the economy and thereby assets towards a world that I personally would not want to retire into. So that created major setbacks against the pension funds, ultimately forcing a lot of these pension funds, or this pension fund specifically, to divest from these assets. And you see the story happening all the time for other financial investment vehicles. And you even, you've seen this particular story in many environments, including the Netherlands and the US, if I remember correctly. So that's then on the allocation stage. Then the other thing is, okay, we have all these assets in the economy. All these sectors exist right now. So we've invested in them already, whether you like it or not. So the question is, how do we change what we already financed and or own? So I'll concentrate on two very specific examples of active ownership by institutional investors. You and I, unfortunately, are a little bit too small to influence financing in today's global economy. But the middlemen are huge. And with that power, they can influence corporate behavior. And there's history to show that they are both influencing it in the positive direction and the not so great direction. That is either through proxy voting or through engaging directly with the companies. So I'll start with proxy voting because I always think that that is the most important democratic process of the financial intermediation chain. Every year, companies have AGMs, and in those AGMs, shareholders will vote on a variety of issues, say on pay of directors, executive compensation, but increasingly every year you start seeing more and more environmental proposals and social proposals. And these proposals explicitly say, I want you, the company, to, in some cases, disclose methane emissions or aspire operationally towards a 2-degree Celsius economy or corporate operations. So those votes are happening every year, but it's not so sure whether yours or mine, pension funds, or any other institutions in the middle are voting the way we would want them to. So you'll see on the right side that some of these guys like BlackRock and Vanguard are just famous for always voting against these. Some, on the other hand, are quite famous, including Allianz, that are always voting for these. And so it increases the likelihood for them to pass. Unfortunately, many environmental proposals, if I remember correctly, somewhere around 50 to 60% of them fail every year. And the reason why the left axis is important over there, everything in green, is because it shows you the amount of assets that these institutional investors have in terms of their assets under management, BlackRock being the largest in the world. So you can imagine all of that 8 trillion or the equivalent amount in listed equity. Every time they vote no, it is a big chunk of the total shares that are being voted no. And quite often those are pension fund products, and the organization is voting no when you and I didn't have an actual explicit say on it. In some cases you have, but unfortunately on average, I believe that not to be the case. And that has important implications. In this particular example, Majority Action did a great report just showing for just 1 year alone, if I remember correctly, they just showed how many would have passed if only one of these guys, Vanguard or BlackRock, would have voted yes. They just have so many shares representing so many households that they influence the likelihood of some of these to actually pass or fail by a clear majority. And these are the amount of proposals that didn't pass, and if they would have passed, would have, of course, in some form or another, influenced corporate behavior towards a sustainable future. So that's not in the, sorry, I'll end with just showing another anecdotal example of how in the future, we will have more involvement in this. But there was an interesting case recently where thousands of Americans called Vanguard, it was the second largest one in the world in terms of the middlemen, to hold companies accountable for political engagement. But this was an interesting part for me because I'd never seen protest against financial institutions telling their own pension provider that I want you to vote this way. So I think in the future, as this demand side from us is going to increase, and it has increased drastically by asset owners in general, we're going to have a little bit more information available to us as to like how our own middlemen are voting and forcing them to change to vote in line with our expectations. The second issue on the post-investments then is directly engaging the company. So the middlemen do have somewhat of a history of engaging companies. You talk to executives, you talk to the directors, you talk to the board members. The idea is that through your ownership and direct intervention, you'll try to change corporate behavior. And there's already evidence to show that in the past 10 years, institutional investors have been coming together and engaging companies directly on environmental and social issues. I'll say a little bit more in just a second on this, but what we do see on average is when these investors come together and they engage the companies and they have explicit criteria on everything from taxes to diversity to climate-related issues. When these engagements are successful, the companies listen. They're basically saying, we hear you, we're going to change our operations to reflect your demands, which we think is also right. When those engagements succeed, you do see the environmental and social scores of these companies changing, implying that their real activities are changing. And this has also been shown to not come at a financial cost either. These companies are seen more valuable in the long run when they're receptive to these types of engagements. And that's when I'll kind of transition to the last bit of the presentation, like where does PRI come in? PRI has a strong history of bringing institutional investors together and engaging on these topics. So they've been doing that for over 10 years, basically. This one is the big one that's currently going on. It's called Climate Action 100 Plus. At the time when I received this snapshot here, there was 410 investors who had signed up representing 40 trillion US dollars. And they have been, it's a multi-year engagement where they engage 160 companies that represent 80% of global industrial emissions. So they're going to them, they're sending letters, meeting executives, and they're trying to influence corporate behavior directly through this investment channel and voice as well as action. And so that's really the biggest one to date. There's been a very strong evolution, both in the proxy voting arena as well as the engagement arena. And individual investors are also getting very active nowadays. And I say very just because it's relative to, I believe, lack of it in recent history. So now they're starting to take this more seriously, and hence their stewardship activities are becoming what they should be, in my opinion. So just to give you a little bit of summary in terms of PRI, because it today brings 3,000 investors worldwide. This is a bit of an old slide. And these investors, the pension funds, the investment managers, asset owners, foundations, insurance companies, service providers, they sign up to the PRI to basically make an explicit public commitment to adopt ESG integration strategies in the investment process. It depends who you are. What does that exactly mean? Because if you're a service provider or a small pension fund, rural UK, the things you can do in terms of ESG issues is very different. But nonetheless, this is the world's largest organization. These are explicit commitments by all these investors across the world, and they currently represent 100 trillion US dollars. And that's, if I remember correctly, over 60% of the financial market, global financial market is being represented here. So ultimately, these are the organizations PR represents in one shape or form. PR itself has offices mostly in London, but has regional representation for those investors across the world. So in case there are investors in Asia, they then have also local contacts to then work with and learn more when it comes to these issues. And when I say learn more, that's a bit difficult thing. It's the same thing as trying to summarize what does the World Bank do or what does the IMF do. You're probably going to need a few hours just to explain the basics, and it's hard to really say what PRI does as well, because it is a lot. Fundamentally, it is about the changing the behavior of institutional investors, and that comes through information and assistance in a variety of activities, just to help them in the growth path toward adopting ESG integration and practices in the investment processes. So we have a variety of teams, investment practices, stewardship, policy, climate reporting, sector relations, all of these different teams in one shape or form assist investors in different ways. So what the practical example for me is that I'll highlight in the last minute. I come from the academic research team. We're building a internal research team that works with hundreds of academics. And basically what I do is I try to harness the power of academia, thousands of professors, and try to bring all the insights that they have to offer and bring that to the investment community so that they can pursue evidence-based policies when they adopt ESG practices in their operations. And that's my role. That's a specific information value that I try to assist as hard as possible, because let's be honest, we're running out of time when it comes to a lot of these important issues. And all these other teams are just trying to assist all other parts of these organizations' needs. It talks sometimes a little bit more about climate, but for those who are interested, PRI, it looks at a variety of issues. So climate is just sometimes a little easier to discuss because you can talk about it sometimes more objectively, because there's X amount of carbon that we can emit. These are the companies that do it. This is where we need them to go. And so it's just a little bit easier to discuss, even though it's extremely complicated. There's a variety of social issues and other issues that PRI works with, whether it be from tax evasion, in this case, modern slavery and human trafficking. I can't speak on behalf of this issue from my team members' perspectives, but the important footnote there, or clarification there, is that 40 million people across the world are in some form of modern slavery in 167 countries, creating $150 billion in illegal profits every year. There's an initiative to help investors to try to begin understanding the exposure that they have to modern slavery through their portfolio companies that they own. This is a difficult landscape. The information and the data is almost unobservable, but at least it seems like a good first step to try to understand and tackle this very important issue. Other issues include a variety of climate initiatives. And as you get, even though I said that climate is sometimes easy, climate is extremely difficult, because when it comes to the finance process, I think you and I, we could say that when it comes to traditionally valuing companies, we can have somewhat of a good idea. If we put enough time and effort to understanding, let's say, Uber's business model, we can go and say, okay, next year their profits are going to be this much. On year 2, it's probably going to be this much. Year 3, if they grow this way, it'll be this much. And we can try to fairly represent the value of the company. The problem with climate change is it's a coordinated action problem. We have so many unknowns here. We know the damages are huge, but we don't know the trajectories quite well. And these are long horizon trajectories. So we need to aspire to a 1.5 degree world by 2050, net zero world, but that requires different actions by companies. It depends on government regulations to change, and governments have been slow to react for 70 years already. So when it comes to trying to even value any future uncertainty or calculate it, it's just all over the place. It is an extremely difficult task to reliably price these issues. You should still do it, but there are, of course, very rational difficulties here. And this is one of the frameworks where the organization with a climate vivid economics specifically have created tools for investors to price in uncertainty from climate legislation. The longer it takes for our governments to react and put a price on carbon, the worse it's going to get for us. And as it gets worse for us and we have more fires, and the less the government does, the more likely there's going to be a tipping point. At some point, the governments are going to price it drastically. And if they do it too fast, it's going to cause massive risks to the financial system. And this is a very sophisticated tool to start investors get into the process of pricing these particular risks. There are many other examples that I could at least summarize, but I'll just end with the academic research part that's hopefully relevant for some people in this audience. when it comes to the research team's activities, it is very similar to that of other research teams from the World Bank and the IMF. Internally, you work with academics. We have an academic network, and you make research, but you try to harness everything that academia has to not only research with them, but also influence the investors themselves. And the way you basically do it is trying to take everything that academia has to offer and give it them to the investors so that they can incorporate in their processes. So hopefully some of this might be interesting for the audience here, because these are things that I started developing years ago, and they are very helpful for master's students, bachelor students, and PhDs as well. The first top over there is an academic review as well as a review, and it's shown by the picture at the bottom. These are practical user tools that allow you to search through different topics from literature, whether you're interested in carbon pricing to social issues, tax evasion to inequality. You can scroll through nicely, and it will show you some set of academic literature on these topics, and to get a better sense of how different disciplines are trying to tackle these difficult topics, but from different lenses. And the data review basically extracts the data sets used by the academic research, and then you can basically scroll through in similar fashion and try to get a first sense of, okay, what kind of environmental data sets do we have at the corporations? What do we know on the social issues when it comes to corporations? Another hopefully helpful tool for if there's anyone here who's either writing a thesis or hoping to do more research on these topics. We do other ways to just showcase academia to the world. We got an annual conference. We just finished it last Friday. It was called the Academic Week because of COVID. It was 5 days of seniors, members of the academic community, many professors presenting on frontier knowledge papers. And we also do a lot of more reader-friendly and listener-friendly ways of translating academia. We got a weekly blog where I'll just say that I find that material extremely interesting. We reach out to academics and they summarize some of the recent work to us, and we spread it to our audiences through the blog, the newsletter. We do podcasts, seminars, and as I mentioned, the conference as well. So hopefully if there's anyone interested here, go to the PRI website. You can see tons of material on hopefully things you might find interesting. And if there's anything education-wise or university-wise that might be beneficial, the academic research page does have some tools to get you started, I hope. That really was the main presentation. Just want to say again, it was a real pleasure to be here virtually with you and to present on these topics that I find really important.
Thank you so much, Mikael. That was extremely insightful and very well put together. That's very much appreciated. To all of our delegates, we're now going to open up the floor here for some questions. You have the option, again, just to run through it, to put your hand up, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question, or you can ask in the chat or Q&A box. I'll keep my eyes peeled on both. It appears that we have one question already in the Q&A, so I will read it out. It's Estee, who's on our executive team, and she says the following: many people do not have the necessary information to make informed choices about how they invest, and therefore the transparency and accessibility of material needed so as for the individual to make the right decision is crucial. Would you be able to tell us more regarding how someone could navigate such extensive quantity of information while still making the right choice? Thank you for your time. Your presentation is truly great.
Extremely important question. Difficult to answer, unfortunately. But hopefully I can give a little bit insights on that, because I'll bring this up when it comes to banking on fossil fuels. This is a nice example. If you're interested in project financing, or sorry, the financing of fossil fuels, and you have a deposit account and happens to be with one of these big banks, this is a nice way for you to let know the systematic aggregate financing that you might be indirectly financing when it comes to these unfortunate issues. Now, you as a household, and myself including, unfortunately, the financial system is, I would say, too complicated for us to have one platform in this world in the near future to tell anyone what they can invest in. So that's why I would urge is to, in every person's case, think local. So if you're in the US or if you're in Sweden, you typically have nowadays social responsible finance organizations within your jurisdictions, and they will typically provide information on what are the sustainable products, financial products you can find. So I think RIIA, which is the Sustainable Investment Foundation within Australia, if I remember correctly, they provided some nice guidance for retail investors. So in terms of like, okay, what should you consider when it comes to your banks? Here are some basic details on the banks that operate in Australia, as well as potentially the social banks. I can't say in this particular case whether they showcase the other banks, so I'm just saying that it's just an example that in certain cases, the local investment foundations will try to assist the local retail savings network on what you can get into. And the other services, if I remember correctly, would provide is, what about sustainable mutual funds? They will provide information on product offerings in Australia and what you should consider and where you can really look. So I think today we are, when I started doing this research, I would say we had absolutely nothing. So it was really difficult to have any sense of who are the good and the bad guys, and who's now becoming more good and who's actually really bad. Now we actually got a little bit more information out there. We got a lot of initiatives pushing hard at the country level on providing more information for everyone. So we're on a growth path. So there's no one solution here. But the other thing that's also helping us is future legislation, including European Green Deal and taxonomy, is going to force companies to disclose. It's going to force institutional investors to disclose on environmental issues. It's going to be a whole new regulatory, transparent, standardized environment when it comes to full disclosure on these issues. These targets are developed over time, and so are disclosure frameworks. But in the next 5 years, you're going to see a lot of jurisdictions that have mandatory standardized reporting. And that's going to, I believe, going to be one of those extra strong pushes to help retail clients as well, because it doesn't need an NGO to do the hard work, like in this particular case, or to just look at what's out there. It's when regulation comes in, which is very much needed, and luckily we're seeing a lot of developments on that front, then we're going to get standardized information. And then through that, we're going to have all the financial information providers and NGOs having access to greater levels of information and making it much, much more simpler for the traditional households. So yes, there are ways to do it. My hope is that we'll achieve a future where it's going to be super easy for us. And there are already a few sustainable investment apps out there, but it depends which country you're in and who's providing it. So I wouldn't market these apps yet because they're just not at the scale yet necessary, in my opinion, unless there are developments I have not heard of.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mikael. I think that answers Este's question. We have another Q&A written down and we have a blue hand, but I'll read this first one out from Kit. He's written, returning to the pre-investment phase, you discussed how returns continue to look attractive for E and S products and investment. Beyond the standard return calculations, return on investment, IRR, etc., is there any measure being developed in academia to accurately quantify value or benefits that exist from a perspective beyond the bottom line?
Another really difficult one. That's good. It's phenomenally challenging because basically you asked in one question everything that academia hasn't been able to solve yet, but is trying to solve. So you were mentioning this particular case. So currently what we observe is the prices of companies and to a certain degree the actions of companies. And those the financial community is trying to price in correctly. As I mentioned with climate change, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. So it's at least good to know that what we see in terms of the returns, the expectations, the valuations is all going towards the right direction. So we're getting smarter, if you will. 10 years ago, most of the traditional financial investment community didn't have almost any knowledge available when it comes to environmental issues and things like that. So one is, I think when you mentioned about just having those metrics is that I think our biggest challenge still really is the fight for information. When we have all the information, at least where we are currently, then we will be a lot stronger in pricing things correctly as well. And so I would say that this is why the regulation point was so important, is PRI quite often, through all its policy engagements, doesn't tell governments use this data or that data. It's telling all the time the governments that you need to create a standardized reporting system for all your companies, because financial institutions are having a hard time knowing the actual pollution of the companies, because the metrics are coming from so many different locations, from so many different standards, and from many jurisdictional environments where unfortunately transparency is nowhere at the degree it should be. So I would say that is the thing that we luckily are understanding collectively we need to aspire to get the real information, to make it standardized, and then have the investors do it. So that's the first order of importance, just knowing where things are today. And it's great that we're getting more satellite-based academic initiatives, not from finance, but from the whole academic community, so that we use satellite level information to understand how corporations are influencing the climate and the environment locally and globally. So then we get really accurate information. Where are we today? The second problem is then on where are we going tomorrow? We have legislation that's the European taxonomy including, which is going to provide sector by sector guidelines and expectations on what these sector and the companies therein must do to achieve a net zero future. And those are the expectations we're expecting investment organizations to then have as well, and price accordingly, and to invest their portfolios accordingly. So that's then the second one, which is the future. Once we can also align our collective expectations on where these companies need to go, then we got out these two important things that are then going to make it much more easier to do what finance does best, which is pricing assets in this economy. I hope that broad overview helps at least a little bit, but it is a very difficult topic. And we also have provided a lot of resources in the academic page when it comes to modernizing modern portfolio theory, because modern portfolio theory was never built to discuss these important topics. And if you're interested more on this very important issue, we have more material there.
Thank you so much for that. So we have one hand up. Emma has her hand up. Mikael, as you are the host, are you able to unmute Emma so she can ask her question?
Let's see. I want to say yes, but I'm also
at the bottom of your screen where you see participants. There you go. So if you hover your cursor over her, you should be able to unmute her.
I'll admit, unfortunately, I'm having a hard time, and this is a shame because the other day you and I were discussing, and I said I had a whole week's worth of practice with Zoom, and clearly now I'm just fading.
No problem.
Live
Here,
everyone.
I can navigate this. Give me one moment. Here we are. All right, Emma, whenever you're ready.
Hi, Michael. Thanks, Jacqueline, for that. Michael, thank you for your fascinating presentation. I just had a question regarding the intermediation chain that you mentioned throughout your presentation, from us with the banks that we choose to deposit our money in, and the impact that we can have. And I was just wondering, with regards to when we make these decisions and these investments from a personal perspective, it is my belief that our incentives lies in more of a political dimension, in the do the right thing argument. Whereas I think that along the intermediation chain with regards to, for example, fund managers, they're faced with very different incentives, which are more linked to financial incentives and costs of engagements and costs of research and their financial returns, which they usually have to match with beating a benchmark and beating competitors. And I just wanted to ask you whether that was sort of in terms of in your work, have you explored regulating and sort of engaging with these incentives and the financial incentives through, for example, tax regulation and really trying to incentivize investors and different market participants along that chain to make change in order to really tackle these financial incentives rather than attacking them through that political lens, which is difficult to balance out with all the different market participants that go through. So sorry for the long question.
No, that's an important one because now, of course, when it comes to, for example, pipeline protests, I think it's an easy, rational choice for us to demand society to aspire to a 1.5 degree future, which is better for us all, economically including. But it comes with a political twist and a preference that can look altruistic. So those are the two things that you quite nicely summarize, that it is difficult to separate out altruism from rationality. And rationality is also difficult because they're a collection problem. There's a difference between short-term and long-term and things like that. Things get fuzzy really fast. So it is important for us to understand that if we're talking about pure altruism and we're willing to forego returns, for example, that is why we have a very large impact investment community as well. And a lot of these socially responsible funds and even impact banks in certain cases, there is realms there where you as the individual are taking explicit choices that I might forego some levels of returns, like a few basis points from your interest rates, from your deposit account, or things like that, to make sure that all your deposits are financing a future that you want. So this is the part where I think it's the clearest, where you and I have every right to pursue that. And that's also where the politics is just right. We got an investment vehicle that is ours, we got the power, and it's going to achieve good impact. And that's the same reason why households need to have a meter in their house. And the choice, the minimum thing that we as households need to have is the choice to have green energy in our houses. I pay more for my energy bills because I want it to be green. And so that's a level in terms of where I think ethics are extremely important, that and the decisions are just right to pursue on that frontier. Now there's the fuzzy stuff where you say in terms of the policy and the regulation, the incentives of the financial intermediation chain. There are good arguments to say that they shouldn't just do whatever they want, invest in all thematic climate renewable projects and maybe even lose money. You can't just let them go wild with altruism, but we're not even close to that thing. So I'm not even scared of it, but it needs to be discussed because the financial system was built with benchmarks to make sure that our pension funds aspire to create the highest returns on our behalf so that when we retire, we get the returns that we deserve. The competitive model was built to maximize our benefits there. That is exactly why these financial institutions, we have fiduciary duty, stewardship codes, and a variety of things to that. And that's the problem, because what I've always said in terms of the big picture is the global finance was never built to solve the environment. Most environmental economists, traditional economists even, always assume when there's externalities in the economy, a central planner, also known as the government, intervenes and puts law and regulation in place. Now, the problem with climate is we've had this information for years and the governments have basically done nothing. And now we're all of a sudden faced with this dilemma where the global capital market is ahead of the governments and demanding for carbon price and a variety of other initiatives. Not all of them agree, but it's a weird moment in time where the financial system is trying to solve the problems it was never built to solve. It was all about efficiency of allocation of money, not as much on tackling these coordinative problems. These coordinative problems matter for the financial institutions because even though I can make $2 with a coal mine, I won't exist in 50 years if we all keep doing that. So it's still not optimal. It's a prisoner's dilemma. And so there's many difficult issues here, but fundamentally it wasn't built to solve it. So then how do we tackle the right incentives? So that's where, in case yourself or anyone in the audience is interested in, PRI has a policy team. It's part where the research team actually works with. And they provide a lot of material on the future of regulation across jurisdictions, on the types of incentives and laws that need to be in place to allow financial institutions to do the right thing, so to speak. And that includes updating stewardship codes, fiduciary duty, and regulation in terms of what investors can or cannot have when it comes to incorporating these issues. So that is essential. We need regulation, and we are getting regulation, but like in the US market, unfortunately, the current administration is taking us back into history. We're not going forward in the US as with other markets. The current administration's actually stopping a lot of these original laws that were in place to make sure that we get to vote on issues. They're making thresholds a lot more difficult. They're also making proposals that are basically written so vaguely. This was by the Department of Labor. The legislation that is being proposed is written so vaguely that it implies that if a financial institution uses environmental and social information to make investment decisions, which you should look at the emissions of the company and value it based on that, because it's so vaguely written, it poses legal liability. And so financial institutions could technically be sued by households for looking at climate data just because it's written so poorly. So again, just to say that the law here is extremely important, so are the incentives. We know the incentives are changing. Fund managers are changing their behavior, partly also because when their behavior is partly dictated by reward mechanisms. Funds win, so to speak, when they get higher levels of assets from their clients. And what we see from a variety of research in academia is that when fund managers and funds incorporate more environmental and social issues in their portfolio asset management, as well as allocation decisions, you see clients rewarding them. And so if you see the clients rewarding them, that's going to influence the fund manager's likelihood to incorporate these important decisions in the investment process. But then the question is for regulation to say, okay, if there is a realm that there might be a return that is being foregone in the short term for the long term, are the incentives right? And that's where, again, regulation is so important. You need both.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting.
So we have one last question and our time is up, but I think we can answer this one question. Mikael, is that okay with you?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have a question from Kayla that she's typed out. And she said, one roadblock for investors in the past has been the difficulties they face in detecting and measuring what the actual risks are. Do you believe that social media, especially in 2020, is playing a positive role in bringing to light several human rights risks?
Absolutely. It's luckily an easy response, though, of course, as with everything, there's a difficult what's next. So we do have a lot of academic evidence to show that it's not just social media. I guess we know that when companies are involved in a lot of unethical activities that are then exposed through social media, journalistic freedom, and other things that just allow the world to know the atrocities that we're creating without originally us knowing. So through the information channel, we're getting more information on how companies are what they're actually doing at the ground level. And we see that on pricing as well. So I have very close friends who look at the pricing of scandals specifically, because when you're looking at these particular violations, it's an information explosion when it comes to the marketplace. And the good story is that the moment the market finds out that a company is doing horrible things, the pricing reacts. So the companies are effectively punished when it comes to those valuations. So that's really on the if we find out we're doing the right thing. The question is, what don't we know? And there's still a lot of darkness that I can only speculate on. When it comes to modern slavery, human trafficking, these are, I think, the best examples of where I'm extremely, as a researcher, I have the least amount of tools available. If I want to look at climate, I luckily have very competitive data provider models trying to give as much climate data to me as possible. CDP, MSCI, Refinitiv, True Value Labs, the list goes on. So on that, we're working hard, and academia is getting stuff through us as well, including the satellite level data that I mentioned. With human rights and modern slavery and a lot of other difficult issues, these by construction happen in the dark. They happen in the gray economies. They don't happen through direct ownership. They happen through supply chains as well. Our supply chain data monitoring is getting better, both for the corporations and the financial institutions looking at them. But that's really the realm where a lot of these bad things are happening, where we still don't have perfect information to identify all these difficult things. It's the same with the garment industry. We know a lot of things are happening that are obviously awful. We just don't know exactly which portfolio companies, which part of the supply chain is actually involved in that indirectly. And so data developments are increasing. And that's where I find the standardization extremely important. That's when we're going to make systemic level changes. The social media is just helping us, because if you have a journalist or anyone else who's on site is seeing something awful, puts it out there, great. Then the world knows, and then we're going to react. We're going to punish them. Hopefully we give them fines as well, and the financial markets are going to react as well. But that's really reactive. That's not the proactive thing. So to make systemic changes, we need full visibility on all parts of the supply chain. And then through that, I hope we can make some great leaps when it comes to these important issues as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for those questions. I'm going to hand it over to Nadia, who is one of our team members, and she's going to thank you and give delegates the next steps.
Hi, everyone. I don't think I can start my video because my Zoom somehow isn't letting me, but just like to say thank you, Mikael, for your very interesting presentation on the emerging field of responsible investment.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, on behalf of the team and delegates, I'd just like to express our sincere gratitude for taking the time out to share your expertise and the work of principles of responsible investment with us. It is very encouraging to see how socially responsible investment is gaining momentum now. And I think we are all looking forward to seeing how it continues to create more ripple effects across the corporate finance sector. Next up, we have a short intermission of 10 minutes starting from now before we come back for the speaker panel. Please feel free to grab a quick drink or snack before joining the panel comprising of many sustainability pioneers. So I'd just like to reiterate that this call will be ending shortly, but when it's time to tune back in 10 minutes from now, please remember to join the conference via the second link that you can find in the email sent to you this morning. See you all at 3:07 p.m. British time, and we hope that you are finding the conference informative and exciting so far. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll be hopping on that link in 10 minutes. And thank you again, Mikael and Nadia.